The moment the elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor, the room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than judgment. A tired man stepped out holding the small hand of a child whose shoes were slightly scuffed, whose backpack was too big for their narrow shoulders, and whose eyes were wide with the confusion of being in a place that did not welcome innocence. Every stare landed at once, sharp and curious, measuring and unforgiving, and in that instant the man wondered if this was the moment his last hope would finally slip away. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and stories that remind us why humanity still matters, please take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel Single Dad Diaries if you stand with people who refuse to give up even when the world looks away. The man's name was Daniel, and he had not planned for this to be how the interview would go. He had planned for a clean shirt, a confident smile, and a quiet moment to gather his thoughts before stepping into a room that could decide his future. What he had not planned for was the daycare calling just an hour before the interview to say they were closing unexpectedly due to a sudden emergency. He had not planned for the panic that rose in his chest as he looked at his phone, calculating time, money, and options he no longer had. And he had not planned for the choice that would define him, not just as a job candidate, but as a father. Leave his child alone, or bring them into a world that rarely made room for struggle. He chose his child, because that was the only choice he had left. Daniel had once been someone people described as promising. He had a degree, a steady job, and a future that looked predictable in the best possible way. Then life shifted, quietly at first, and then all at once. His wife became ill, the kind of illness that drains not just the body but the savings account and the spirit. Hospital visits replaced vacations, and overtime replaced rest. When she passed, the grief was sharp and sudden, leaving behind a silence that Daniel did not know how to fill and a child who looked to him as the only constant left in the world. The job that once supported them was lost during restructuring, and the safety net he thought existed disappeared beneath his feet. Since then, Daniel had learned how thin stability really was. He learned how to stretch meals, how to turn lights off earlier, how to smile through exhaustion so his child would not sense fear. He learned how to send out applications late at night after bedtime, and how to rehearse confidence in the bathroom mirror before interviews that never seemed to lead anywhere. Each rejection chipped away at him, not because he doubted his skills, but because every no felt like a verdict on his worth as a provider. Still, he kept going, because his child's small hand in his reminded him that quitting was not an option. The building he stood in that day was everything his life was not. Glass walls, polished floors, and people who moved with certainty, carrying themselves as if the ground beneath them was guaranteed. Daniel felt the weight of every scuffed shoe and wrinkled sleeve as he signed in, feeling eyes follow him and his child across the lobby. Some stares held curiosity, others annoyance, and a few carried something close to pity. None of them felt kind. He tried to shrink himself, to make his presence smaller, but it was impossible when the quiet curiosity of a child drew attention wherever they went. As they waited outside the conference room, Daniel's thoughts raced. He worried about appearing unprofessional, about being judged before he even spoke, about the unspoken rules of corporate life that never included single parents with no backup plan. He worried about how to explain himself without sounding like an excuse. Most of all, he worried about what this interview meant. This job was not just a paycheck. It was rent paid on time, groceries without counting coins, and a future where his child did not have to hear apologies whispered in the dark. Inside the room, the atmosphere was stiff. Papers were neatly stacked, chairs perfectly aligned, and the air carried the faint scent of expensive coffee. Daniel felt every second stretch as he took a seat near the edge, keeping his child close, whispering reassurance through a gentle squeeze of the hand. He focused on breathing, on posture, on remembering the answers he had practiced, even as he felt the silent judgment settle over him like dust. The interviewers maintained polite expressions, but their eyes flicked, again and again, toward the child, as if trying to reconcile competence with circumstance. Time moved strangely in that room, as if the minutes were aware of the stakes. Daniel answered questions with honesty and restraint, drawing from years of experience and lessons learned the hard way. He spoke about problem solving, about resilience, about adapting under pressure. He did not speak about grief, or late nights, or the fear that sometimes woke him before dawn. He kept his voice steady, even when he felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Through it all, his child sat quietly, coloring on a scrap of paper, unaware of how much rested on this moment. Then something shifted. The door at the far end of the room opened, and a presence entered that changed the energy completely. The CEO had arrived, unexpectedly, their reputation preceding them like a shadow. This was someone known for sharp decisions, high standards, and little patience for inefficiency. The room straightened itself, back stiffened, and Daniel felt his heart sink. If there had been any chance of understanding, he feared it was gone now. The CEO's eyes scanned the room, taking in the neat lines, the nervous faces, and finally, the small child sitting beside Daniel. The pause that followed felt endless. In that silence, Daniel braced himself for dismissal, for embarrassment, for another lesson in how unforgiving the world could be. He imagined walking back out into the lobby, past the stairs, with nothing but apologies and another unanswered application. Instead, something unexpected happened. The CEO did not speak right away. They simply observed, taking in the quiet determination on Daniel's face, the way his body leaned protectively toward his child, the subtle signs of a life carried under pressure. Without a word, the CEO reached for 2 chairs near the head of the table and pulled them closer together, not as a gesture of authority, but of inclusion. The movement was simple, almost casual, but it changed everything. That small act spoke louder than any speech. It told a story of recognition, of seeing beyond appearances, of understanding that professionalism and parenthood were not opposites but often intertwined in the most human ways. The room exhaled, tension loosening its grip, and for the first time since arriving, Daniel felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. It was not confidence, and it was not relief. It was the fragile beginning of hope. The interview continued, but the tone had shifted. Questions became conversations, curiosity replaced judgment, and Daniel found himself speaking more freely, sharing not just what he could do, but why he did it. He spoke about responsibility not as a buzzword, but as a daily practice. He spoke about leadership learned through caregiving, about patience forged in sleepless nights, and about motivation rooted in love rather than ambition alone. The CEO listened closely, not interrupting, not rushing, absorbing every detail. As the meeting came to an end, Daniel stood, unsure of what the outcome would be, but certain that something important had already happened. He had been seen, fully and honestly, not as a liability, but as a person shaped by circumstances that demanded strength. As he gathered his things, he felt a hand briefly rest on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement that lingered long after the room emptied. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. Daniel returned to his routine, balancing hope with realism, refusing to let himself imagine too much. He packed lunches, walked to school, and checked his phone more often than he wanted to admit. Every unknown number made his heart jump, every hour without news stretched thin. He told himself that regardless of the outcome, he had done his best, and that had to be enough. When the call finally came, it came quietly, without drama. An offer, fair and steady, with benefits that promised not just survival, but stability. Daniel listened in disbelief, gripping the edge of the counter as if the world might tilt without warning. As the details settled in, so did the weight of what this meant. It meant evenings without fear, weekends without dread, and a future that felt open again. It meant dignity restored in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. But the true impact of that day went beyond employment. It reshaped how Daniel saw himself. He no longer felt like a man constantly apologizing for his circumstances. He felt like someone whose experiences had value, whose sacrifices had meaning, and whose love for his child was not a weakness to hide, but a strength that carried him forward. The CEO's simple gesture had done more than offer a job. It had offered validation. Months later, Daniel often thought back to that interview, to the moment when judgment turned into understanding. He carried that lesson with him into his work, treating others with the same quiet respect he had been shown. He became known not just for his skills, but for his empathy, for the way he noticed people who felt invisible, for the way he made space where none seemed to exist. His child thrived too, growing up with a front-row seat to resilience, learning that courage sometimes looks like showing up exactly as you are. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that compassion can change lives in ways we may never fully see, please take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Single Dad Diaries so more stories of hope, struggle, and humanity can be told. Before we end, we have a special request for you. Please comment below and tell us what this story made you feel, or share a moment when kindness changed your life or someone else's. Your words matter, and they might be exactly what another viewer needs to read today. Because sometimes, all it takes is pulling up 2 chairs and choosing to see the person in front of you, not for what they lack, but for everything they carry.